Hi, welcome to Creepy Crime Cases. On today's episode, we will be covering a case that left a young man so heartbroken and alone for the most part of his adult life. I want to personally welcome you to today's episode. Thank you for your time. I will be seeing you at the end. A 911 call came in just after 7 a.m. on May 13, 2010. On the line was a teenager, her voice trembling, filled with panic. "My dad's dead. There's blood everywhere. I can't go in there." On the recording of that emergency call, later played in court, the girl can be heard sobbing. Her words painted a picture that sent first responders racing to the Fryer family home in Guthrie, Oklahoma. This case would test the boundaries of family loyalty, justice, and forgiveness. And it all began with that single, haunting phone call. In the heart of Logan County, Oklahoma, sits the quiet town of Guthrie, a place where life moves at a steady pace, where families know each other by name, and where the rhythm of small-town living offers a sense of comfort to those who call it home. Among the many families that lived in Guthrie was the Fryer family. Their home was not unlike the others scattered across the county. Modest, lived in, filled with the memories of ordinary life. But behind its doors, a story was unfolding that would one day grip not only Guthrie but the entire state, a story of lies, betrayal, and murder. At the center of it all was 50-year-old Louis Keith Fryer, known to friends and family as Louis, and his teenage daughter, Kaylee Lynn Fryer. Louis was a man defined by hard work. He had spent much of his life trying to provide for his family, balancing the daily demands of work with the even heavier burden of raising children in a world where right and wrong often blurred. Those who knew him described him as stern at times but steady, the kind of man who believed in discipline, responsibility, and teaching his children the value of honesty. For Louis, fatherhood was not just a role, it was a responsibility that guided every decision he made. His love was firm, sometimes strict, but always rooted in the belief that his children deserved a path better than his own. Kaylee, on the other hand, was a teenager navigating the turbulent years between childhood and adulthood. She had dreams, frustrations, and secrets, the kind that every teenager carries, but hers would soon take on a darker shape. To many in Guthrie, Kaylee appeared like any other girl her age. She attended school, spent time with friends, and moved through the routines of adolescence. But within the Fryer household, her relationship with her father had begun to fray. What began as small arguments over rules and boundaries grew into heated conflicts that left both father and daughter at odds. Louis's attempts to enforce discipline clashed with Kaylee's growing desire for independence, and their home became a place marked by tension rather than peace. Despite the arguments, there was still the bond of blood, a connection that no amount of conflict could erase. Louis, for all his sternness, carried the weight of being both a protector and a provider. He believed that if he could guide Kaylee through these years, she would emerge stronger, more capable, ready to face the challenges of life. But what he could not see, what no one around him could fully grasp, was that Kaylee's frustrations were deepening into something far more dangerous. Outside the walls of the Fryer home, Kaylee had begun to find comfort in a relationship that would change everything. A 22-year-old man called Jerry Jerome Childs, Jr. Jerry was more than just a boyfriend. He was an escape. He offered her the affection she felt her father denied her, the validation she craved, and the promise of a future free from the rules that bound her. Their relationship intensified quickly, drawing her further away from the stability her father tried to maintain. It was a bond built on passion, secrecy, and, eventually, deception. For Louis, Jerry was a threat, not just because of his age, but because of the influence he had over Kaylee. A father's instinct told him that this relationship was not healthy, that it pulled his daughter into a world where recklessness could flourish. He disapproved, voiced his concerns, and tried to place boundaries around Kaylee's life. But in doing so, he only widened the distance between them. To Kaylee, her father's actions felt like control, like an attempt to keep her from the happiness she believed she deserved. The more Louis resisted, the more determined she became to hold on to Jerry. What no one realized then was how far Kaylee was willing to go to protect that relationship. Her father's disapproval would not simply push her toward rebellion, it would set her on a path toward betrayal. In Jerry, she saw not only love but an ally, someone who would listen to her grievances, someone who would act on her behalf. And slowly, she began to weave a narrative that painted her father not as a man trying to guide her, but as an obstacle standing in the way of the life she wanted. As the months passed, the cracks in the Fryer household widened. What had once been disagreements between a father and his teenage daughter were now full-blown battles that left the air inside the house heavy and unsettled. To Jerry, Kaylee was vulnerable, a girl caught between the strict boundaries of her father and the allure of freedom. To Kaylee, Jerry was salvation, an older man who seemed to understand her frustrations, who told her the things she wanted to hear, and who made her feel powerful in ways her father never did. Their connection quickly transformed from a teenage romance into something far more dangerous. Fueled by secrecy and defiance, their bond was forged in the belief that they were united against a common enemy, her father, Louis Fryer. As the conflict deepened, Kaylee began to employ a weapon more destructive than anger: deception. Words became her tools, carefully chosen and strategically delivered. Lies took root, not just in her conversations with Jerry, but in the very foundation of their relationship. One of the most significant was the story she told him about being pregnant. She claimed she was carrying his child, a revelation that struck Jerry with both fear and responsibility. Whether she believed this lie herself or crafted it solely to secure his loyalty remains a mystery, but what is certain is the impact it had on Jerry. Kaylee nurtured this lie carefully, using it to escalate her complaints about her father. She painted Louis as a threat, a man whose strictness had transformed into cruelty, a father whose presence endangered not only her happiness but the safety of the life growing inside her. She told Jerry stories of mistreatment, exaggerations that twisted ordinary arguments into tales of oppression. Each word she spoke worked its way into Jerry's conscience, convincing him that the only way forward, the only way to protect her and their supposed child, was to eliminate the problem entirely. As the plan solidified, Jerry prepared himself for the violence he believed was necessary. On the night when talk finally gave way to action, the Fryer home stood in its usual quiet. Louis Fryer retired to his bedroom that evening, unaware that the comfort of his home had already been compromised by a plot that had taken root weeks earlier. Outside, Jerry Childs approached with hesitation and determination in equal measure. The stillness of the night pressed in on him as he neared the Fryer property. Each step was heavier than the last, his pulse quickening as his mind raced back to the conversations he'd shared with Kaylee. He remembered her words, how to get into the house, where to find a knife, and how to locate her father's bedroom. He clung to those images as a kind of shield, convincing himself that the violence he was about to unleash was justified. Jerry's hand trembled as he carried the weapon he had chosen. It was no longer a hypothetical thought in whispered conversations. It was a tool of death, the instrument that would turn his girlfriend's fantasies into reality. Each step brought him closer not just to Louis's bedroom, but to a point of no return. Inside the house, Kaylee waited. She knew what was about to happen. Every beat of her heart carried the weight of anticipation, the knowledge that the plan she had nurtured for so long was about to unfold. She moved about carefully, ensuring the path was clear, ensuring that Jerry's entry would not be met with alarm. When Jerry entered, he moved quietly, guided by Kaylee's instructions, his footsteps careful but deliberate. Louis lay in his bedroom, unaware of the presence that now moved toward him. The door opened, and in an instant, the quiet night shattered. Jerry lunged forward, the knife flashing in the dim light. The fight was brutal, short, and final. Louis, though strong, had been caught off guard in the place where he should have felt most secure. Each strike of the blade weakened him, his strength fading with every passing second. Jerry, overwhelmed but determined, continued until there was no more resistance. When the last sounds of struggle subsided, silence returned to the room, a silence thicker, heavier, and irreversible. As the night carried on outside, the Fryer home became the scene of a tragedy born not of random chance, but of deliberate intent. The sun rose the following morning over Guthrie, casting its light on streets that stirred with their usual calm. Neighbors carried on as they always did, unaware that within the Fryer home, tragedy lingered unspoken. The night's violence had left its mark, though hidden from view, waiting only for discovery. What began as an ordinary day in Logan County was about to unravel into shock, confusion, and fear. The scene in Louis's bedroom told its story without words. His body lay still, lifeless, his wounds marking the violence he had endured. The struggle that had played out the night before was frozen in the room's disarray. The overturned objects, the blood on the bed and on the walls, the silence that followed. After the 911 call that Kaylee made, within minutes, law enforcement was on its way. The Logan County Sheriff's Office responded swiftly, their vehicles pulling up outside the modest Fryer home, lights flashing against the quiet backdrop of the neighborhood. Deputies stepped from their cars, their faces set with the seriousness of men and women who knew the weight of what they might find. They moved carefully, scanning each room, until they reached the bedroom where Louis's body lay. The sight confirmed what the panicked phone call had already suggested. This was murder, brutal and deliberate. The first priority was to secure the scene. Yellow tape was stretched across the doorway, neighbors gathered outside, and whispers spread quickly along the street. Inside, investigators documented every detail. Photographs captured the placement of the body, the stains on the bed walls and the angles of the blood spatter. Nothing was too small to note. The sheriff himself arrived, his presence a signal of the seriousness of the case. His voice was steady, but his eyes reflected the weight of the discovery. He spoke to his deputies, issued instructions, and began the slow, careful process of piecing together the puzzle. They knew that somewhere in this house, in this scene, were the answers to how and why Louis Fryer had been killed. Outside, Kaylee was questioned. She stood among the gathering crowd, her expression unreadable. She explained little, offering fragments of words that seemed rehearsed, vague, and detached. To the trained eyes of law enforcement, her demeanor stood out. Suspicion began to form in the minds of the investigators. It was too early to accuse, too early to conclude, but the contrast between her behavior and the horror inside the house was stark. They took note, filing away the details for later, as they continued to process the scene. Word of the murder spread quickly through Guthrie. Within hours, the town buzzed with disbelief. Louis Fryer was known by many, and his death sent a ripple of fear and sorrow through the community. Neighbors spoke of his kindness, his work ethic, his devotion to his children. That such a man could be killed in his own home shook the sense of security so many had taken for granted. By the end of the day, the Fryer home was transformed from a place of family life into a crime scene sealed off by tape and guarded by deputies. The body had been removed, taken to the medical examiner's office where an autopsy would confirm the violent nature of his death. And so, even as the house emptied and the sheriff's deputies drove away, the story was only beginning. A murder had been discovered, a community had been shaken, and the first seeds of suspicion had been planted. In the hours following the discovery of Louis Fryer's body, the investigation began to take shape. Detectives from the Logan County Sheriff's Office moved quickly, aware that the first 48 hours are often the most crucial in solving a homicide. The initial interviews started with family. Officers questioned neighbors, relatives, and, most importantly, Louis's daughter, Kaylee. She was the last person known to be in the home with him, the one who should have been devastated by the crime. Yet her answers raised more questions than they resolved. When asked about the night before, she offered vague responses, speaking in half-formed sentences, as if carefully weighing each word. She avoided eye contact, her voice calm in ways that seemed out of place. Detectives, trained to read both what was said and what was left unsaid, noted her demeanor with growing unease. What puzzled them most was her lack of visible grief. A child who loses a parent under violent circumstances often displays shock, confusion, or even uncontrollable emotion. But Kaylee remained curiously steady, her words distant. Some detectives wondered if she was in denial, her emotions locked behind a wall. Either way, her behavior set her apart from the grieving relatives around her. Investigators turned their attention to her phone records. Modern cases often unfold not just in crime scenes, but in digital footprints, calls, texts, and searches that reveal the hidden lives of those involved. Subpoenas were issued, and soon, Kaylee's communications began to tell a different story. Among them were frequent exchanges with a young man named Jerry Jerome Childs Jr., her boyfriend. Their messages, often late at night, carried an intensity that caught the investigators' attention. Jerry's name was not unknown in Guthrie. At just 22 years old, his reputation had already begun to form. A troubled past, brushes with authority, a restlessness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. His closeness to Kaylee instantly raised the possibility that he had knowledge of, or even involvement in, the crime. And as they read through the texts exchanged between the two, suspicion hardened into near certainty. The messages revealed a world that had been hidden from view. Kaylee had told Jerry she was pregnant, though no evidence supported the claim. She had painted a picture of a father who was cruel, controlling, a barrier to the life she wanted with him. In her words, Louis became the obstacle, the source of every struggle. Detectives could see how those messages worked on Jerry, feeding into his emotions, his loyalty, his desire to protect her. Each exchange nudged him further along a path of darkness, a path that could have been connected to the murder. But text messages alone were not enough. Investigators needed more. They began piecing together Jerry's movements on the night Louis was killed. Witnesses reported seeing him near the Fryer home, his car parked not far from the property. Surveillance cameras from nearby businesses placed him in the area at critical times. Slowly, a timeline formed, one that showed Jerry traveling to Louis's home in the hours before the murder. As the pieces gathered, the focus sharpened. Detectives brought Jerry in for questioning. At first, he denied everything, his voice firm, his story rehearsed. He claimed he had been elsewhere that night, that he knew nothing of what had happened to Louis. But the weight of evidence was already pressing against him. When confronted with the phone records, his composure began to crack. The late-night calls, the messages filled with Kaylee's manipulations, the sightings of his car near the Fryer home, it was too much to explain away. The questioning continued for hours. Jerry shifted in his seat, sweat forming on his brow, his hands restless against the table. Detectives leaned in, their voices steady, their questions relentless. They spoke not just of the crime, but of Kaylee's role in it. They suggested that she had used him, that she had twisted his loyalty for her own ends. They pressed him to see himself not as a monster, but as a young man caught in a web of lies. Slowly, that angle began to work. The first cracks appeared in Jerry's story when he admitted to being near the house. He tried to frame it as coincidence, claiming he had gone there to talk to Kaylee, not to harm anyone. But as the hours wore on, the truth began to surface. His voice grew quieter, his words less certain. Finally, in a moment of exhaustion and defeat, Jerry admitted what investigators already suspected. The confession was partial at first, fragmented, filled with half-truths and evasions. But piece by piece, the story emerged. He spoke of Kaylee's lies, of her insistence that she was pregnant, of her repeated claims that her father stood in the way of their future. He described the pressure, the manipulation, the weight of believing he was acting to protect the girl he loved. And finally, he admitted that under that influence, he had taken Louis's life. The confession confirmed what they had feared, that Kaylee had not only known about the crime, but had played an active role in orchestrating it. Jerry had wielded the knife, but the plan had begun with her words, her deceptions, her demands. It was not just a case of a boyfriend lashing out in anger. It was a calculated act, born from a daughter's betrayal. The next step was clear. Both Jerry Childs and Kaylee Fryer would be charged. What began as an investigation into a father's death had become the story of a conspiracy, a partnership forged not in love, but in manipulation and deceit. And as detectives prepared their case, they knew the hardest part was yet to come. Convincing a jury would require not just evidence, but a careful unraveling of a relationship that had led to murder. Jerry described the night of the murder in stark detail. Kaylee had spoken to him throughout the evening, her voice steady on the phone, her words filled with urgency. When he reached the house, he slipped inside through the door she had left unlocked. He moved toward the bedroom, the knife cold in his grip. There, he found Louis asleep, his body stretched across the bed, unaware of the intruder who now stood over him. Jerry's voice faltered as he described the moment, his face contorting with guilt. When detectives finally left the room, they carried with them a confession that shifted the entire case. Jerry had admitted to wielding the knife, but he had also painted Kaylee as the manipulator, the instigator, the force behind the crime. For the prosecution, it was gold, a narrative that showed premeditation, conspiracy, and a chilling betrayal of blood ties. For Jerry, it was the beginning of the end, a decision that would seal his fate in court. In early spring, the community gathered there for a trial unlike any it had ever seen. The room itself seemed to tighten when the jury filed in. The prosecution began with a narrative that gripped the courtroom immediately. They spoke not just of murder, but of betrayal, of a daughter turning against the man who had provided her with shelter, food, and protection. They reminded the jury that this was no random act of violence, no robbery gone wrong. It was, they said, the result of deliberate planning, manipulation, and lies. Lies about a pregnancy, lies about danger, lies that ultimately convinced a young man to carry out an attack on someone who never saw it coming. The jurors leaned forward as the prosecutor's voice cut through the silence, painting Kaylee not as a bystander, but as the mind behind the crime. Evidence followed swiftly. Phone records displayed on screens showed dozens of calls exchanged between Kaylee and Jerry in the hours leading up to the murder. Text messages revealed her urging him to act, her steady reassurance that this was the only way to secure their future. The prosecution played the recordings of Jerry's confession, the words halting but unmistakable. But the defense pushed back, their strategy aimed at sowing doubt. They argued that Jerry had every reason to shift blame. They reminded the jury that he had wielded the knife, that his hands carried out the act, that his choices alone determined the outcome. They suggested that his confession was colored by regret, by the desire to lessen his own sentence, by bitterness toward a young woman who refused to shoulder his burden. They portrayed Kaylee as naive, as someone caught in a whirlwind of a troubled relationship, too young and impressionable to foresee the consequence of her words. Witnesses were called to the stand. Friends of Kaylee spoke of her relationship with Jerry, the intensity of it, the way she seemed consumed by it. Teachers described her as quiet but distracted, often lost in thought, her grades slipping as her attachment deepened. A family friend recounted moments of strain between Kaylee and her father, arguments that ended in slammed doors and icy silence. Each testimony added texture to the story, filling in the spaces between fact and motive. Then came the detectives, recounting the investigation in meticulous detail. They described their interviews, the inconsistencies in Kaylee's early statements, the moment Jerry's confession aligned perfectly with the evidence. Their calm, measured delivery carried weight, presenting the case not as theory but as fact meticulously gathered and verified. When Jerry Childs himself was called to testify, the room hushed with tension. Shackled and dressed in the plain uniform of an inmate, he walked slowly to the stand. His voice trembled as he recounted again how Kaylee had convinced him that her father was a threat, that she was pregnant, that they had no other option. The defense pressed him hard, suggesting he was lying to protect himself, but Jerry did not waver. He looked directly at the jurors, his voice breaking as he admitted to the killing but insisted he had been led to it by her insistence. For some jurors, the rawness in his voice lingered long after he stepped down. Throughout it all, Kaylee remained mostly silent. She rarely showed emotion, her eyes fixed on the table before her. Closing arguments brought the trial to its peak. The prosecution's voice rang with certainty, reminding the jury of the lies Kaylee had spun, the way she had pulled the strings while standing at a safe distance from the knife itself. They told the jury that Jerry had been the hand, but Kaylee was the mind, and without her, the crime would never have happened. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom sat in silence, the weight of weeks of testimony hanging in the air. Families clutched each other's hands, waiting. The minutes stretched into hours, each tick of the clock echoing like a reminder of what had been lost and what was still at stake. The courtroom was heavy with silence when the jurors filed back in, each step echoing against the polished floor. Their faces gave little away, masks of solemn duty shaped by hours of debate behind closed doors. Family members leaned forward, hands clasped tightly together, breaths held in anticipation. Every eye in the room fixed on the foreperson, who carried the folded piece of paper that would decide whether Kaylee Fryer walked free or spent the rest of her life behind prison walls. The judge asked the standard question, his voice steady but edged with gravity. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded, unfolding the slip of paper slowly, as though aware that each motion would reverberate far beyond that room. The air itself seemed to still, the walls pressing in as the words were spoken aloud. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Kaylee Lynn Fryer, guilty of first-degree murder." All attention shifted to Kaylee. For weeks she had maintained the same composure, her features controlled, her posture still. Now she sat motionless, her eyes fixed straight ahead, her expression unreadable. There was no outburst, no visible collapse, no tears. For some, that stoicism was unsettling, a final confirmation of the coldness they had come to associate with her. The judge moved swiftly to sentencing. The crime was severe, the evidence overwhelming, and the state had argued from the beginning that anything less than life would not satisfy justice. The words were delivered clearly, without flourish, as though formality itself carried the weight of justice. "It is the judgment of this court that you, Kaylee Lynn Fryer, are sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole." The phrase landed like a stone dropped into deep water, rippling through the courtroom, each syllable striking with finality. Louis Fryer's family sat quietly as the decision was pronounced. His absence hung heavier than ever. The man whose life had been taken now represented only in memories and photographs clutched tightly in their hands. For them, the verdict was a measure of accountability, a declaration that his death had not been ignored, that the system had recognized the depth of the betrayal. But it was not victory. Justice, in this case, was tangled with loss so permanent that no ruling could erase it. From the gallery, whispers spread. Some saw the sentence as merciful, the possibility of parole, a chance for Kaylee to someday step into freedom, though far in the future. Others thought it too lenient, arguing that orchestrating the murder of one's own father demanded the severest punishment imaginable. Kaylee was led away in chains, the metallic clink of the shackles the only sound as she stood. For a fleeting moment, she turned her head, eyes scanning the room, as if searching for a familiar face to anchor her. Whether she found it or not, no one could say. In seconds she was gone, escorted through the side door that led not back to her life, but into a system that would contain her for decades, perhaps longer. Outside the courthouse, the air was alive with tension. Reporters crowded the steps, cameras rolling, microphones extended toward anyone willing to speak. Prosecutors expressed satisfaction that justice had been served, emphasizing the thoroughness of the investigation and the bravery of those who testified. Defense attorneys issued brief statements, vowing to explore every option for appeal, insisting that their client had been unfairly portrayed. Even within the prison walls where Kaylee was sent, her story followed her. Inmates whispered about the case, guards exchanged quiet remarks, the details spreading beyond Guthrie into the broader fabric of Oklahoma's criminal history. She was no longer just Kaylee, the daughter of Louis Fryer. She was the young woman who had conspired to kill her father, the figure at the center of a case that blurred the line between victim and perpetrator, between family and betrayal. And yet, for all the attention, for all the arguments and debates, one truth remained unshakable. A man was dead, and nothing, no verdict, no sentence, no prison walls, could bring him back. The echoes of that truth reverberated long after the gavel struck, long after the jurors were dismissed, long after Kaylee disappeared into the custody of the state. It was a truth that would shadow the Fryer family forever, a wound stitched closed by justice but never truly healed. Jerry Childs carried the weight of the case. His confession had opened the truth, his testimony had secured the conviction, but his own role in the murder had sealed his fate as well. He was also sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. He was not remembered as the sole architect of the crime, yet he would never escape the knowledge that he had taken part in ending another man's life. For him, the promise of youth was gone, traded for a legacy marked by violence. His name, like Kaylee's, became tied permanently to the Fryer tragedy. As time passed, anniversaries of Louis's death came quietly, each year reopening wounds for those who loved him. Friends gathered, sometimes at his gravesite, sometimes in their homes, to share stories and remind each other of the man behind the headlines. The case also sparked conversations beyond Guthrie, reaching into the broader discussions of family violence and manipulation. Legal experts dissected the trial, criminologists studied the dynamics between Kaylee and Jerry, and communities across the state used the case as a chilling reminder of how lies and resentment can escalate into destruction. In classrooms where criminal justice was taught, the Fryer case appeared as a case study, its details pored over by students trying to understand the fragile intersections of psychology, family, and crime. Yet for all the analysis, for all the voices weighing in from afar, those closest to Louis Fryer carried the deepest burden. Keith Fryer, Kaylee's older brother, also felt the brunt of his new reality. According to him, he says, "I speak to Kaylee on the phone, and she still maintains what happened wasn't really her fault, which is why I haven't been able to forgive her yet. It's sad, but I've just accepted that's the way it is." Years later, as the case faded from headlines, its memory remained alive in subtle ways. The house where the crime occurred stood as a landmark of silence, its walls holding secrets that no one dared speak aloud. The courthouse records preserved the transcripts, each word catalogued in black and white, frozen testimony of the night that shattered a family. And in Guthrie, those who had lived through it still remembered, their memories sharp despite the passage of time. The Fryer case was more than a story of crime. It was a story of trust broken, of family bonds fractured, of a town forced to confront the unthinkable. It asked questions that could not be answered, stirred emotions that could not be soothed, and left scars that would never fully fade. And for anyone who heard the story, it was a reminder of how quickly ordinary life can collapse into tragedy, and how the echoes of that collapse can endure for generations. And that's all we have for today's episode. Do you think Kaylee was guilty? Or was it just a card her married boyfriend played just so he wouldn't go down alone? Let me know in the comments. As always, do not forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy more contents like this. Goodbye.